Hello and welcome to Driver's Therapy. Today we're going to be doing the R33 GTR Buyer's Guide. If you're not familiar with our channel, we have the #1 Acura NSX Buyer's Guide. We also have the #1 Toyota Supra Auto Twin Turbo Buyer's Guide, and we have one of the top 3 S2000 Buyer's Guide. So with hundreds of thousands of views, you guys are going to definitely get some good tips and advice for your next R33 GTR. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the R33 GTR has been my dream car for a long time, but before I owned this, I owned a 1995 R33 Nissan Skyline GTST. I owned that for 6 years, so I know my stuff. And we just imported a Honda S800. We imported it from Netherlands. It went on a container ship and then we had to do all the custom paperwork. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because we're real familiar with the importation process and the Skylines. All right, so what is the first thing you should watch out for the Skylines? Well, for pretty much any R33 GTR, the first thing you're gonna wanna look for is rust. Rust is probably going to be the biggest deterror and biggest issues you will ever find with the Skyline. And if you're not familiar with that issue and if you're not looking out for it, you could lose a lot of money and you could import a car that has a lot of issues. As a matter of fact, rust would probably be one of the top 3 things that you really need to watch out with the GTR. Now, where would you look for rust on this car? Well, in my opinion, you're going to want to look in 3 main places. First off, you're going to want to go ahead and lift up the trunk area. You're going to want to get where the spare tire is, and you're going to want to remove the spare tire. When you do that, you're going to want to look around that area, look at the seams. You're going to see kind of like this whitish, gluish stuff that's put on the seams and stuff like that. But you want to look around there. And if you start seeing signs of rust on the bolts or anywhere around the metal or the sheet metal, that's not a good thing. Another thing too is on the strut towers. You're going to want to watch out for any rust, any pitting, anything like that. Then the most important area is underneath the car. So you're going to want to get some really good pictures, or if you are looking at the car in person, you're going to want to put it on a lift. When you put it on a lift, you're going to want to inspect all the chassis, the bolts, and everything. And if you find anything that looks like rust, then you're going to want to determine what level of rust or corrosion or pretty much deterioration is at what point it's at. So essentially, rust has different levels. You have surface rust and you have rust that's pretty much eaten through the metal, and it's made the metal essentially useless. And it flakes away like a really good croissant, which is a food relation or whatever you want to call it, but it's the best example of how bad rust looks like. It's flaky, it falls apart, and it's usually unrepairable, and you don't want to even get into that business or buy a car with rust like that. All right, so after you've inspected for rust in those areas, not only that, I always recommend that you take your time looking for rust, and if you have any questions about it, always ask like a very good, knowledgeable body guy if that's even fixable, if it's an issue. All right, so what's gonna be the next thing? Well, when it comes to these cars, you probably know all the information about the 25 years, about the importation laws, and essentially what kind of cars you could buy and when and where. So essentially the R33 GTR is legal. If it was imported illegally, you're good to go. So for me personally, I bought this from somebody who imported it already from Canada. Had all the right paperwork, custom paperwork, had everything in line, looked right, felt right, was already titled, and we made sure that even though it was already titled, that there was some importation paperwork that we could get. Now the seller went ahead and blacked out like his personal information, because when you go through customs, you have to give them information like your name, social security, and a bunch of other information, and you probably don't want to give that away either as a seller or as a buyer. You just don't want to give that information away, but you're going to want the importation paperwork. But essentially, if you're going to be buying an R33 GTR and you're going to be dropping a lot of money on one, you just want to make sure that those ducks are in a row. All right, so what's going to be next? Well, One of the things about this car, like I said, is the rust issue. But after that, we really got to talk about the mechanical portion of it. This car is very, very intricate. In its time, it was super advanced, had some crazy technology in it. And as a matter of fact, now that it's about 26 to 28 years old, you want to make sure that those electronics are working well. You want to make sure that everything's correct. And what you essentially want to do is you want to make sure that you look through the car very well. So we're going to start with suspension, and then we're going to go into the engine. So as far as suspension goes, the rear steering system, or HICAS, is a big thing. Some people in the US or just all over the world, they like to remove it and they use a HICAS delete system. And what that does is it just kind of locks the wheels down, and you can essentially remove that system if it's failing, or you want to reduce the weight, or you simply don't like its handling characteristics. I don't know why you would do that, but some people do. And on top of that, a lot of people also switch out some of the rear suspension components to give them some additional toe or some additional camber adjustments. Because when you lower these cars, it's something that I'm actually might look at in the future, you don't have a lot of adjustments, you know, because you've got the HICAS system back there, and there's also kind of a limit to the original toe and the original camber assessment. So you want to look in the back of the suspension and see if anybody's tinkered with it, if anybody's messed with it, and if it's stock, you just want to make sure that the HICAS isn't throwing a code, or it doesn't, you know, it looks bad, corroded, it just looks beat up, or it's handling inappropriately and it's just not driving right. So you just want to make sure you look at that. As we continue, you know, this car is all-wheel drive, so you're just going to want to make sure that the car actually handles and all those systems are working correctly. So it's one of those things that the first thing you want to check for is make sure that the oil was changed out, or change it out yourself. Also, the characteristics of this car is that it's majorly a rear-wheel drive car. So essentially, you're not going to really see a lot of action with the front-wheel drive unless you're pushing it, and that's why your front torque meter really doesn't move if you're just driving a car normally. You really have to push that car, hit those G's for the front to actually activate. So in order for you to actually experience that, you're going to want to do it in a safe environment, and just make sure that everything's working. Make sure you don't have any dummy lights, and just make sure that nothing is leaking. And so really, those are the main things with the suspension. Now, one of the things about these cars that they're getting older is the shocks. You just want to make sure that the shocks look good, that the boots look good, and that there's no issues with that. There's no sagging, there's no bouncy rides, because as these cars get older, those wear and tear items definitely will need to be addressed or replaced sooner or later. So remember, as you buy these cars, the more modified they are, the more due diligence you're gonna have to do, because a lot of the times, depending on the individual, if they didn't do the swaps or the installation correct, or they didn't do the suspension geometry correctly with an alignment, a corner balancing, it's actually gonna handle worse than it did from the factory. Remember, this car was the first car ever to beat the 8-minute record for the Nürburgring. It is a masterpiece in its right as it is. All right, so now we've got to talk about the RB26. So let's go ahead and change up the scenery and show you what we're talking about. So this is my RB26. It's not going to be as clean as the ones that you see that are for $100,000 and more, and that they're special LM series. This car has some mileage, but it was taken care of, and it's had a lot of recent service. So this is a good thing. Now, some of the things that you're going to see in a lot of Skylines, you're going to see flaking on the valve cover. They call this a valley cover, your timing belt cover, and this intake. And we actually put out a video how to touch it up with some regular DIY automotive paint, and it made a huge difference. But you're gonna see that, and essentially you're not really gonna be able to do anything about the intake unless you remove it and have it, you know, powder coated, or you have it refinished. The same thing with these. Just so you guys know, the R33 GTR came out, which is black. Unfortunately, I tried to do some research and see if you could put the R34 covers on, and I didn't get a lot of information back. But if you're confused about the red and the black, the red is for the R34 and the black was standard for the R33 GTR. Now, one of the things I want to tell you as far as engine, what you need to look for is, one of the first things when you're looking at a car is you want to go ahead and pull out the dipstick, look at the oil, check. Then you want to make sure that there's some type of history, some type of recent service or information about the timing belt. That's going to be really important. So in my case, the timing belt and the water pump and the intake gasket and some other things were replaced recently, and the turbos were put some new turbos were put in. So those are some of the things you want to look at if you're looking at a stock GTR. Now, some of the weak points for the GTR are going to be the turbos. So you're going to want to make sure that those are in good condition, that you don't have any issues. Now, this being an inline six, going back to the turbos and compression and all that, this is an easy car to do a compression test. So doing a compression test isn't a bad idea, especially if you're going to be dropping a huge chunk of money on this car. Now, one of the things that you really want to get whenever you're getting an RB26 is essentially this area right here. This is a complicated airbox system, but I think it does a fantastic job. As a matter of fact, there is a lot of pieces to it. You have this snorkel intake right here. This is where your filter goes. This is kind of the area where the air goes through the two MAFs, and then you have a little piece right here that connects to a duct by the fender. Believe it or not, if you're not familiar with all of this and you go look at a car, this might be missing. And that's gonna suck because you really can't find that and you don't wanna pay hundreds of dollars just for it. So having the stock intake system is a really good thing. Now, from what I understand, you could buy some carbon fiber intake pipes, or you could buy Gretti's like intake kit that does like a MAF delete and it's all shiny and stuff like that. But it might even be an upgrade, but I really think just having the stock intake setup is going to be a really important thing. So now coming along here, what else are we supposed to be looking at? Well, with the RB26, again, you're going to want to make sure you do a compression test. You're going to want to make sure you ask about the turbos, and you're going to want to make sure you ask about the recent maintenance. Again, this is a timing belt, so it's going to come with some maintenance that's required. Either it was done or it wasn't done. But as far as that goes, you're going to want to quiz the seller because these motors are a lot more intricate. I had a Supra for 6 years, and the 2JZ was a little bit more simple in the way that it was designed and as far as the maintenance goes. Now, these came out with 5W30 oil weight requirements, but you will literally have a headache trying to find out what oil to use because everybody recommends something different. Some people say that RB26s need a little bit more oil pressure. So these motors are a little bit more intricate when it comes to the oil debates. But for me, I'm gonna be sticking close to what the manufacturer recommended. All right, so here's the crazy thing. If you're new to GTRs, these things right here are really important. So you have Series 1 and Series 2 headlights, and they're pretty much the same, except if you accidentally run into a car that actually has the HID headlights. Believe it or not, the HID headlights for the R33 is about $10,000. You heard it, $10,000 if you want those really cool headlights. They are awesome. They change the whole front end of the car, and if for some reason you get that and you get it at a bargain, you just hit the lottery. But that's one of those things you really want to look at. What type of headlights is the car coming in? If for some reason they're coming with HIDs, you got to factor that into price because you might be getting a steal. So the cool thing is that if you think about these cars, they're like 25 plus years old, and look at this interior, guys. This interior looks fantastic, and that's what you're gonna want because seats are really expensive for the GTR original seats. So you're really going to take that into consideration. You don't really want to blow off a driver's side seat that's really bad. You want to really understand that that's going to cost you a pretty penny if you're going to upgrade. Now, this is one thing that I have to give you guys, you bigger guys, a heads up. These are really tight seats. As a matter of fact, if you are heavy set in any way, you're going to have a hard time with these seats. This is something that people won't tell you either out of being politeness or just not mentioning it, but these seats are very narrow and they are not going to be comfortable, and you're going to want to replace them if you're on the heavy set side. So you just want to make sure that if you're going to want an R33 and somebody has some bigger, wider seats, that might be the one you want because, again, that's going to make the world of difference. So one of the things you're going to look at is if it has an aftermarket radio, you want to make sure the climate control works. You want to make sure your 3-center gauge pod is functional, and you're just going to want to make sure that everything looks good. Now, one of the most popular things that people do on these cars is switch out the gauge cluster, and there's a lot of controversy about that, and we're going to talk about that right now. So what about this odometer and gauge cluster controversy that's out there? Well, it's something that you guys really need to take into consideration when you're looking at an R33 GTR or pretty much any JDM car of that area. So let me break it down. I know some of the people out there who might be doing something wrong, it's not gonna like this because I'm gonna tell them how it works. But essentially, before we had things like Carfax and we had a lot of digital records and you could keep track of cars, you know, if you went in and got an oil change, somebody would record it. In Japan, they had different systems, you know, and not only that, there's different languages. So whenever you import a car, essentially you could just put a gauge cluster in there with half the mileage, and how are you going to verify that, you know? Unless you have some documentation from like 3 owners from Japan, you could speak Japanese and you could hunt down whatever they call in Jiffy Lube in Japan and ask them questions, you're out of luck, like completely out of luck. So you really want to make sure that essentially the car's condition and the odometer and any paperwork you get matches. And you want to be a little bit diligent with that, because if you're buying a car and you're forking up an extra 30 grand because it only has 20,000 miles, you really want to make sure it really has 20,000 miles. And a way you can tell if a car really has those mileage is how the undercarriage looks. How do those bolts look? How does the interior look? How does the engine bay look? You could tell how much mileage a car has. And if for some reason the car is mint and they decided to roll back the mileage, well, I mean, at this point, who knows? I'm not an advocate for it, but it essentially tells you why people are doing this. It's not a good thing, but you need to be aware if you're trying to pay a premium for a low mileage car. All right, now I did skip over something, and that is the transmission. A lot of people like to go full Toretto on Fast and Furious on these, the new Fast and Furious, violent and crazy. And you're gonna be damaging synchros, you're gonna be damaging gears. And the thing about it is you're gonna wanna drive the car and you're gonna wanna make sure that all those gears are good, because if they're not, yeah. So essentially, my car has a new transmission and the owner picked it up from utilizing Nissan's Heritage program. If you're not familiar with that, that's Nissan's program that is reproducing new parts for the Skyline. So to give you an example, you could buy a new block, you could buy a new head, and you could buy a new transmission for reasonable prices, because essentially they're still making it, which is pretty cool. Okay, so we're wrapping it up. One last thing I'm gonna talk about is OEM parts and aftermarket parts. If your Skyline comes with an aftermarket exhaust, great. Do they have the original exhaust? Even better, take both of them. Do they have the original wheels? Anything original you want to get. If they don't, that's fine, but just know that if you get a GTR with the OEM exhaust, you're gonna take it off. That's almost a fact. So just weigh that whenever you're looking at a car, especially for a buyer's guide. You just want to think ahead of like, hey, when I get this car, what do I plan to do? Do I plan to change out the wheels? Do I plan to change out the exhaust? Do I plan to change out the seats? And when you factor that in, you could actually save money when you're looking at R33s, because you could possibly buy one that has that already done and you don't have to spend that money after you purchase your new GTR. All right, guys, well, thanks for watching this video. If you found it helpful, please hit the like button. Please share it with the appropriate groups or your friends. And if you're inclined to, buy me a cup of coffee, because if I saved you some money, or if I saved you from buying a bad car, hey, you could buy me a coffee by punching that thanks button right underneath the video and just, you know, donating and helping support the channel in any way you can. All right, guys, we appreciate you watching. You take care. And if you do buy a new R33 GTR, congratulations, and make sure you subscribe to stay tuned so you can find out how to do some cool stuff to your GTR. All right, we'll talk to you later.